time to talk about the Washington Wizards. Just because we think they're going to be bad, that doesn't mean there isn't stuff for us to talk about. In fact, there's a lot of stuff for us to talk about, and we're going to do the talking to a couple of people. One of them is Michael Bolton.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NBA fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, and I'm a big fan of the Washington Monument. I'm also the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter, as always, at redrock_bball, on TikTok at redrock_bball, and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Today's episode is brought to you by, actually, it's not brought to you by anybody. In fact, all I got to tell you that you need to just double bang. You need to check that we're free and available on all platforms, and you need to subscribe and leave comments and ring the bell and all of that great, fantastic, amazing stuff. And speaking of great, fantastic, and amazing stuff, we are talking to the host of the Locked On Wizards podcast. Brandon Scott is back with me. Brandon, welcome back to the show.
Oh, appreciate the invite, Josh. How you doing?
I'm good, man. It's good to have you back on here to talk about this Wizards team, who again are going to be very bad, but they are bad in a weird way, where there are players that are good and should play, and players that should get minutes in certain areas, and it's hard to sort of figure it all out at this point, as this team really does undergo a transformation over the next couple of seasons. They've made their moves, and they're still building, and they're still going from there. But it is going to be a season of still some pain, but with some bright spots, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of like last season, where before the deadline and after the deadline, they're kind of two separate seasons. Before the deadline, you're going to see a lot of the veterans being showcased for trades, or some, trying to move off from a lot of these vets. And then the second half, you're going to see a much younger team. So, we're knee deep in the second year of a rebuild. So put your seatbelt on, because it's going to be a while.
Yeah, that's it is going to take that little bit of time. That is that's how these rebuilds go, and especially the better ones. They just take that amount of time to get through and to get everything cracking. And we're just going to talk about let's just start by talking about the guys who have left this squad, Brandon, over the off season. We know that they traded, it's the guys that have arrived, not the guys left. They bring in Jonas Valanciunas, they draft Alex Sarr, they trade for Malcolm Brogdon, they draft Bub Carrington, they draft Keyshawn George as well. So there's a mix of veterans in Valanciunas and Brogdon there, and the young guys. I guess, do you think there's any more moves coming with this team before we hit into training camp?
I think that the roster you look at now is probably going to be this opening day roster. Now, looking at a player like Jonas Valanciunas, with him being connected to the Knicks and the Lakers, to me, he would be the first guy that would be traded. He very well could be traded before the deadline, but I think a lot of the veterans on this roster are going to be gone by the deadline.
Yeah, look, I guess we sort of had that idea last season, and they didn't really go super hard into that. They did make the move of trading away Daniel Gafford, but they didn't go super hard into moving these pieces. And especially someone like a Valanciunas, who they bring in what many people, I guess, would think is a below market deal. Or do you think there's just he is possibly sort of brought in to be I guess a help to Alex Sarr, someone to come in and be that player to just give that size and give that bulk to sort of protect him a little bit in the front court, I guess.
Yeah, I see two main reasons why we brought in Jonas Valanciunas. One, to be that mentor to Alex Sarr, because you see it with Summer League. He definitely needs to learn to be a lot more aggressive. And Jonas Valanciunas is a guy I think is going to be able to push him in practice. And Jonas has been that guy he's a Wizards killer, number one, every time we play him. But he's a guy that always played with a chip on the shoulder. So I think from a mentor standpoint, he's good for Alex Sarr. Number two, Will Dawkins going off the Oklahoma City Thunder model, which is bringing in contracts, flipping them for assets. The biggest thing for the Wizards is acquiring young players and draft assets. So.
Yeah, so obviously that's what they need to. They need to be getting more players in. And the guy that you think is going to be the biggest addition to this team is Alex Sarr, the number 2 overall pick. I don't want to focus too much on the dreadful numbers coming out of Summer League. Tell me the good things that we saw in Summer League from Alex Sarr.
Well, you see potential. And I get potential. It may not be enough for most people, but for a team like the Wizards, potential is a starting point. You look at a lot of guys from the last couple of drafts under Will Dawkins, Bilal Coulibaly. The biggest thing with him is potential. Same thing with Alex Sarr. You see the potential. Obviously, he's very raw. Both him and Bilal are very, very raw players coming out of the draft. But, the first thing you're going to see out of Alex Sarr is going to be his rim protection. You see massive strides with his rim protection. That's going to be the first part of his game you're going to see. And I think that with proper development under head coach Ryan Keefe, the offensive side is going to come. It's going to take a little bit, but it's going to come.
Yeah, look, he's an interesting player, and obviously the shooting numbers are horrific coming out of Summer League, like 12% shooting from three, and he had that over 15 game, like that. But that's not real, right? Like, we know that no one is going to shoot those numbers for an entire season, and he was doing a bunch of things that he won't do during the regular season. So I don't think we need to be overly concerned about some of that showing. I guess some people were worried about some of the tendencies, the settling, the not drawing free throws, but I think that, Brandon, you'd agree with this. A lot of it is just the environment and the situation. They put them in these uncomfortable spots to try and see what they can do. And I don't think we're going to see that level of worry. Now, I guess there are some concerns around Sarr, how the talk of, he didn't want to go to Atlanta. He didn't want to be a 5. He needs to be a 4. They bring in a center to play alongside him. So that does suggest to me that they will be playing him exclusively as a 4. Where do you see him in his best position? If not this season, but at least long term?
That's a good question, because if you look at the modern day NBA, it's positionless. You know what I mean? If you look at the position of point forward, the biggest thing with the Wizards, especially with Will Dawkins, is versatility. Guys who can play multiple positions. If you look at a lot of guys on this roster, they can play multiple positions. Even if you look at Deni, who's now a Trailblazer, the biggest thing with him was the fact that he can guard 1 through 5. If you look at Alex Sarr, he can play the 4, he can play the 5. Bilal can play the 2, the 3, the 4. So versatility is the name of the game in the NBA. And looking at Alex Sarr, I see him predominantly at the 4, but if he makes certain strides, especially as far as his weight, build muscle, showing a lot more aggression, he very well could be the 5 of the future. Because if you look at next year's draft, obviously we're not going to be very good. So Cooper Flagg, if he happens to fall on our lap, he's a guy at the 4. He could very well push Alex Sarr to the 5. So I think he's really the judge of that. If he puts the work in and really gains some muscle and shows aggression, be able to, work in the paint, he very well could be a center. But right now, he's more finesse, and right now, power 4 is the best position for him.
I think that's probably true. I think, again, long-term center will be the best spot for him. He's 7'40", protects the rim. There's some stretchability perhaps there, but you're right. He's not strong enough at this point. He's still really young, and they've got that bulk in there. So I don't mind that initial play on where they're going to have Sarr and what sort of role he's going to be playing on this team. I don't really think there's a giant concern, at least in year 1, but we know that he's going to be given a fairly sizable role on this team. We'll get to projected starters in a minute. Just talking about where he sort of fits on this team. We'll get into the guys that left this team in a sec, but before I go and do that, today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience is the formula for winning championships. It is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed or power or style, eBay Motors has you covered. And with over 122 million parts available for your number one ride or die, you will find exactly what you're looking for every time. And you know it's going to fit because they've got eBay Guaranteed Fit. And if it doesn't fit, you just get your money back, because with eBay Motors, you are burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts that you need, it's easy to make your car the MVP. So head across to ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply, and eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to US customers. Okay, let's talk about the guys that left this team now. Brandon, the number 1 guy on this list is going to be Deni Avdija, who had somewhat of a breakout last season. There's Tyus Jones, Landry Shamet, Eugene Amari, Jules Bernard, who played some minutes down the stretch. We are going to get into talking about Deni in just a sec. I just quickly want to talk about Tyus Jones, and I guess he was brought in as part of that Kristaps Porzingis deal. Moving on from him, I guess this transitions us to talk about some of the other guards here. They are putting more faith in either Malcolm Brogdon being a full-time point guard or Jordan Poole taking over that role. How do you view what they're going to be doing there?
I know that the organization does love Jordan Poole, especially long-term. They like the long-term look at him and potentially Bub Carrington in the same backcourt. I think that, looking at Tyus Jones, I think right now, or rather go back to last year, when he went down with the back injury, Jordan Poole was able to show what he can do. Yep. And in the second half of last season, we were actually number 1 in pace. And this is a good, if you look at the makeup of this team, he seems ready to run. Go back to Alex Sarr. He's a guy who very swift on his feet for a guy who's 7'3". And so Jordan Poole, I think, is the best recipe at starting point guard. Malcolm Brogdon, I think you very well could see him start in certain matchups, but I think the best place for him is the second unit, 6-man, working with Bob Carrington, being that mentor, because we want this team to be faster, and Jordan Poole is going to provide that for us.
Well, in terms of the guy that is the biggest loss from this team, is the aforementioned Deni Avdija, who did have that sort of semi-breakout at times last season. I thought he started off a little bit slow, but it was his first time as a full-time starter. He's obviously not on the team anymore, so I don't want to harp on this too much, but like for a guy that was on what is considered a unbelievably good contract, who had a semi-breakout, why were they so quick to move on from him? My theory is that maybe they don't think he's got a level of scalability even further from where he was. They obviously didn't draft any Avdija this front office, but were they like, hey, we've got this great asset, he's young, like why did they say, okay, well, you're not actually a part of our rebuild? What was the idea there? Or was the offer just too good for them to pass up on?
I think the offer was too good for them to pass up because, like you said, 23 years old, we drafted him, we developed him, finally broke out. He shows star potential. I did not like the move at all. I thought, because again, we're in a rebuild. So, how do you really justify trading away a 23-year-old player that you developed and he finally broke out? But I mean, if you look, he had the best value. And you could say that because on draft night, I fully expected that it was going to be Kyle Kuzma because I knew that they wanted to trade back into the lottery. I thought that the Sacramento Kings was going to be that moment where we can move Kuz and get back into the lottery. So I was very surprised when we moved Deni. To me, it's just the best. They found a good deal. I mean, Bob Carrington is going to be a really good guard in Washington. And like I said, I'm not a big fan of the move. I'm a big Deni guy. I think that, again, moving on from a 23-year-old guy that you developed early on in the rebuild is very questionable. But, he provided them with the best deal, and he provided them a chance to get back into the lottery, which I think was a really, really good move by Will Dawkins.
Yeah, so they get that pick. They get a future pick in there as well. And again, look, yes, it is a really good deal and it is hard to pass up. But I also think that if they did view him as this foundational future star, I'm not certain that they would have even taken that deal necessarily, because like it's a good deal, but it's not like the greatest deal of all time. So I don't really think that it's a I don't think it's a one where we couldn't possibly have not we couldn't possibly have passed on this sort of deal. I don't think it's that level of situation that they missed out on in this situation. But he's gone, and there's going to have to be other players that step out and step up, and that's where we come into looking at your projected starters for this group. We've got Jordan Poole, Bilal Coulibaly, we've got Kyle Kuzma, Alex Sarr, and Jonas Valanciunas. I happen to think that this is probably how they will go there. That is playing Kuzma a little bit out of position, and obviously that means that Carrington and Brogdon and even Corey Kispert comes off the bench. We're going to talk a little bit more about Kuzma later on. We've spoken about Valanciunas arriving and Sarr arriving. What did you think of Bilal in his first season with this team?
Showed massive potential. I mean, he's athletic. Defensively, he's a dog, and we need more dogs in DC. We've been more of a finesse team on defense. We need to become a better defensive team. Under previous coach Weston Steele Jr., they really didn't have a defensive identity. Under new head coach Ryan Keefe, they started to develop one. So Bilal Coulibaly from the defensive end, very polished already. With his steals, with his blocks. I mean, he's just as proud as the defensive end. His offensive game, again, kind of like Alex Sarr, very raw coming out of the draft. His three-point shot, if you look at the numbers, not bad, but his release is slow, so he's got to have a fast release. His ball handling, was dribbling too high, so you definitely want to see him improve his ball handling, develop a mid-range, develop counter moves. But I think he will get there because, again, I bring up Ryan Keefe all the time at head coach. His resume as a coach who knows how to develop talent is immaculate. So they're going to develop Bilal and Alex Sarr. But, Bilal, the biggest thing you'll take out of his rookie year was this is high motor. He's got a very high motor.
Yeah, and he did work pretty well. We're going to talk a little bit more about Bilal in a second, but I thought he showed a few things. Obviously, it is going to be tough for someone like that coming in their first season. But, yeah, I don't really see any other sort of lineups that there's any likelihood that they go with here in this situation. This just seems like the pretty obvious scenario there. I guess we are going to talk Jordan Poole a little bit more later on, so I don't want to go too deep into him here. But let's just bring in and talk about your projected bench group with this team, because we do have Bob Carrington and Malcolm Brogdon and Corey Kispert and Rashawn Holmes. That is a lot of guards. So once we get through the Bilal and the Kuzmas, there's not much there in terms of wing depth on this team, is there?
Not right now, because, we also signed Sadiq Bey, but he's out for the year, or he's going to miss 3/4 of the season coming off of an ACL surgery. So wings right now is kind of up in the air, because Corey Kispert, he can play the 2, he can play the 3. He's going to kind of be positionless on the second unit, and he's a guy who very well could start also at 2 guard. depending on certain matchups. But wing, we have Patrick Ballmer Jr. He's a guy who hasn't shown a lot, but he's, his 3-point shooting used to be his hallmark. You definitely want to see him become a better rebounding.
It did used to be his hallmark, but he was absolutely terrible at it again last year.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, his 3-point shot was his MO, and he wasn't even dropping that. So, he's a guy who potentially be on the wing too, but they got him at the 4. Another guy to kind of look at on the second unit is Marvin Bagley Jr. He's the aspiring contract. He can play center, he can play the power forward position. So, yeah, I mean, I know right now we're +1, so we have one guy we need to kind of get rid of, and we're looking at Johnny Davis probably being the guy. So looking at the second unit, and we haven't even talked about Keyshawn George, another guy who has high potential. So. Again, like we kind of talked about in the beginning of the show, the lineups that you see before the deadline are going to be completely different from the lineup you see after the deadline.
Yeah, that's true, because there will be a lot of changes that does happen with this team as they make these moves and they bring guys on, and someone like a Malcolm Brogdon's probably going to play minutes early on, and then he'll be disappeared off this roster at some stage. Very similar to what happened with him last year over in Portland. You did mention it already. I will just get into it just to quickly mention about Saddiq Bey, who they did sign at somewhat of a discount in free agency, but he tore his ACL in March. So the idea here is that Saddiq is just not going to be available for most. There's no reason for him to really play. But have you heard anything that they might try and bring him back for 5-10 games or whatever in April, or are we just basically writing this season off?
Good question. Right now, from what I've heard from the organization, they're going to take time with Saddiq Bey. I mean, there's really no reason to rush him because they're in a rebuild. And we'll probably get a clearer picture when we get close to media day and get close to the training camp. But right now, they're going to take their time because that was a really good signing too. Because without the ACL surgery, you're not getting Saddiq Bey on that price tag. So they really bought low on him. And he's a guy who, high motor guy. He's from the DMV, from the DC area. So he's got local ties. And he's very intriguing for the future too, because, I mean, the time, we often talk about the timeline, which is a big reason why I thought that, they moved Deni. Because if you look at all 5 draft picks under Will Dawkins, they're all 19, 20 years old. The timeline changed. At first, Deni, Corey Kispert, Jordan Poole were all considered to be part of the future. Now, they're going younger. If you look at Alex Sarr, he's 19, 20 years old. The guys who are really part of the young core, none of them can buy a beer right now. So that's kind of the thing about the timeline. Yeah,
that's true. Now, you talked about the new coach, Ryan Keefe, is in. What did you see from him last season or what did the team see from him to promote him to the full-time coach?
I noticed from him early on, because going in there for press conferences, I noticed his demeanor. When he talked about his players, first of all, he cares about his players. And I get it, it's not everything, but Weston Steele Jr. was a guy where you didn't really get a lot of emotion out of him. On the sidelines, he's kind of, very stoic. Ryan Keefe is a guy who he's a player's coach who holds a standard, if that makes sense. He's a guy who holds him to a standard. He built an atmosphere of, holding people accountable. And then you saw a different team when he took over as opposed to Weston Steele Jr., where it was really no standard, really no, he wasn't holding anybody accountable. So Ryan Keefe, the second thing is development. If you look at his resume, I mean, James Harden, Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, Kristaps Porzingis, Brandon Ingram. A lot of these guys owe a lot of their game to Ryan Keefe and that's why I'm a big believer in him and the coach, especially for a team that needs to prioritize development.
It is going to be interesting to see what he brings now with a full off-season and training camp as the main guy in charge and what he can bring on this team. We are going to talk about a player that you've got here for us to watch. And he's the guy that everyone was rightfully angry with me last season. I thought he was going to have a really big season in Washington, and he didn't very, very clearly. Jordan Poole was poor, especially early on during the year. What I thought would happen was he would be the guy that would have the ball in his hands, his usage would go up, and somehow his usage went down playing on the Wizards versus where it was on Golden State, which is not something that obviously I saw coming whatsoever. So in terms of where Jordan Poole, I'm so confused. I was going to talk Jordan Poole. We'll talk Jordan Poole now. He's your make or break, not your player to watch. But anyway, we're talking Jordan Poole. You referenced the end of the season last season. So Kuzma was in and out of the lineup there. What was, Tyus Jones was out, but they put the ball in his hands. And not everyone was watching Wizards games in March and April, rightfully so. So what was different about that Jordan Poole at the end of the year?
Well, I mean, they played him to his strengths. He's a guy who needs the ball in his hands. And to start the season, they had him and Tyus Jones the same backcourt, which was a recipe for disaster because when you have a backcourt with two undersized guys who defense for neither one of these guys serves as a priority, is an undersized, defensively bad lineup. And he's just not a two guard. He's not a guy that, he can play off ball, but not, as a full-time gig. When he reverted him to 6-man role, he was able to dictate pace. He was a guy that, dictated the flow of the offense. And then when he took over for Tyus Jones, when Tyus Jones went down, in the same reason, he was able to dictate the flow of the offense. And when you have a team full of guys who are ready to run, the pace was rolling and you got the full potential, not only out of Jordan Poole, but out of the team overall.
Yeah, so like we expect that he comes in and starts the year as the starting point guard on this squad. That usage at only 26 is obviously a really not high. It was at 30% in Golden State. There were times early on in the season where Jordan Poole appeared broken on this team. Like he was making terrible mistakes. He wasn't caring. He looked downcast. Was there, you said that the organization is really in and believing in Jordan Poole. Like, did you see a change in sort of that mentality or vibe with him?
Oh, absolutely. I firmly believe that he needed time to acclimate to a situation. He went from a contender in Golden State where he was kind of shielded by the leaders there, Stephen Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, and they kind of, took him along slowly from a maturity standpoint, where coming to DC, you're expected to be kind of the co-captain with Kyle Kuzma being the guy. And early on, he had to acclimate to where he's at, a lot of pressure to carry on a franchise that's kind of in the gray area. So, he had to take time to acclimate. He took a lot of criticism and, definitely from my channel, man, we gave him a lot of criticism, but I always said on my platform, man, that he's got too much talent to fail. You saw that in Golden State. And so when he finally put that work in, and really ignored the outside noise, you started to see results. And he kept working and he kept working.
Yeah, he did. He was much better in that period where the ball was in his hands and he was running as that point guard. And even the best results we saw from him in Golden State were the periods when Steph Curry was out as well, where he was running as that point guard. Now it is a little bit, we still got Malcolm Brogdon there. We still have Bub Carrington, who was drafted, I guess, that they hope can be somewhat of a point guard as well. So it'd be interesting to see exactly how they view this with Poole. But like last season, what we also saw is Kyle Kuzma having the ball in his hands a lot. He increased his assist rate. Like, to me, I don't know how you see this, Brandon, but I would have thought that they would be more prioritizing Jordan Poole. He's younger. They traded him as part of that Bradley Beal trade eventually. Like, I thought he would have been more prioritized, but it was Kuzma who was getting all those shots. Why do you think that was?
Well, I definitely know he's very much liked in the organization. He's setting up roots in the DC area. He's opened up a couple of restaurants. I think that has a lot to do with it. I mean, to me, it's questionable. Like, there's a few things I had a problem with. If you look at the deadline, when they asked him about a potential move to Dallas, I had a problem with that, where it's like, no disrespect to Kyle Kuzma, but is he really the tier of a player where you're asking him whether he wants to be traded or not? And if you look at the asking price for Kyle Kuzma, which is 2 first-round picks, and kind of goes back to the Deni trade, which is, we often in DC overvalue our guys. We overvalued Bradley Beal. Obviously, when we signed him to a supermax and gave him the only no-trade clause in the league, we overvalue guys, and we have this small market mentality. And the crazy thing is, the DC area is not a small market; it's probably one of the biggest markets in the country. Yeah. So, it's a mentality of the organization, and it's slowly changing. The front office is very popular with its fan base. New front office, there's no more Tommy Shepard, no more Ernie Grunfeld, and owner Ted Leonsis is finally giving a lot of leg room for this front office to do their job. Where in the past years he was very involved with the decision making. So getting back to Kyle Kuzma, he wants to be here. He likes being here. He's cool with playing with a rebuilding team. Those are things that the organization likes, but to a certain degree, you have to move him at some point.
You do. Now, the part that I should have mentioned earlier is when we talk about the player to watch, because you've got Bilal as that guy for this season. So we talked about some of his early struggles. He was a low usage player. He was actually a surprise starter early on in the preseason, and then he hurt his wrist. He did get demoted at some point during the season to a bench role, but he played probably more than I think a lot of people expected early on. So what's the next step for Bilal this season? Like here, 14 usage, 27 minutes. I'm expecting those minutes to push up. Do you think that he actually does more on ball, or is it just more like, hey, let's have a bit more confidence in the shooting? Let's play a little bit more regularly with the starters?
I think you're going to see him still a little bit off ball. I think the ball handling, you definitely want to see progression in his ball handling, but I don't think he's ready to be that type of player to try to get other people involved. You want to see his 3-point shot, be a lot faster. If you look at the league, playing in France, you look at defense there, they give the shooters a lot of room to get the ball off. And in the NBA, they don't give you any time. They're going to be in your face. There's going to be a hand in your face. So, he had to acclimate to the NBA coming over from France. And I think that you're going to see a much faster guy this season. I mean, because like I said, I fully expect this offense to be fast. And Bilal, man, he's a guy who's a skywalker. He's a guy who can move in transition. So, and that's why I think that, again, going back to Jordan Poole, why it really behooves the organization to make him a starter, because it makes guys like Bilal better, makes guys like Sarr better, just running and gunning. So,
how does that, to move a little bit off Bilal here, talking about the pace, Valanciunas is slow. He is very slow. And they bring him in at this contract again, providing that strength. How do they run with that? In terms of Valanciunas and minutes, does that mean that he's going to play a 25, 26 minute role, and they go with some of the other quicker players at center, whether that is, Vukcevic is not particularly fast, but Marvin Bagley's a better mover, and Rashawn Holmes is probably a little bit better mover than Valanciunas. How does that all tie in? Yeah,
I think you're right. I mean, it's going to be around 25 minutes. I mean, they have 3-4 centers that they have to try to find a way to rotate minutes with these guys. I mean, Jonas is a guy, again, is a trade chip, so he's going to be gone, in my opinion, before the deadline. Rashawn Holmes, he's a guy that you probably want to get off his contract. Vucevic, second-round pick, you definitely want to see what you have with him in a full season. And then, Marvin Bagley, third. I mean, he's a guy with an aspiring contract, so they're going to prioritize these vets first. But Jonas, like you said, he's a guy who, in this stage of his career, he's starting to decline. He's definitely not a guy who's going to be sprinting down the court. I definitely see a lot of overlapping in minutes, and you definitely give Marvin Bagley and Rashawn Holmes a lot more minutes, especially in certain sets where they want to push the ball.
That brings us to my burning question for this team this season, and I think we've covered a bit of this already, but my question was, and you answered, is Kyle Kuzma really the player that he thinks he is, or this organization seems to think that he is? Because he's not, to me. He thinks that he's this. Yeah, he's been. He's doing whatever he's doing at the moment over on Twitter. He's talking about how you can't talk about the NBA and history without talking about me. He's turning down trades. The organization is feeding some of that by giving him that option. What is that about? Why is he not? Why is he? Because everyone's got to have that confidence, but it doesn't make any sense that, for as good as he can be being a role player, and we've seen it before, he's not this guy that both parties seem to be pushing him to be.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think that it's 50-50. On one hand, it's definitely on him. He's saying some crazy stuff. It's an election year, so he's going to talk politics, going back and forth with fans. It's not his best moment. But if you look at the organization, they kind of gave him that power to a certain degree, because, again, at the trade deadline, at the point when they consulted him on a potential trade to Dallas, to me, that was come on, man. I mean, like you said, nothing against Kuz. He's a good player, but he's not that tier of a player where you consult him on a potential trade. And I think that gave him a lot of power, where it's okay, I have a lot of autonomy to do and say whatever I want. And, and with this being a bad team, that gives him the platform to do so. If this was a team that was contending, and especially when you have vets on the team, they're not going to let him do that. So it shows, maybe he's a little bit too big for his britches a little bit in DC, but he's a guy who has shown leadership here in DC, but he has that LA state of mind. I'll say that.
He is someone that's again, he's improved lots of areas of his game. He's improved his passing last season. He became a better rebounder at times. He's able to ramp up usage, but defensively he still struggles. And if you have running him as a number one option, you are going to be the worst team or the second worst team in the NBA. That is just what is going to happen. And we saw that happen again. So it is a weird scenario. I hope they don't back themselves into a Bradley Beal type scenario of overvaluing and putting the eggs into a guy that, and Beal's a significantly better player than Kuzma, putting themselves into that basket of, this is our guy and look how much he loves being in DC. Because you talked about small market versus big market before. The Wizards have operated as if they're running out of the smallest town in the world. It's no one wants to come and live here. We're so humble with our 300,000 citizens. Bro, you're a huge city. You're the capital of the country. You're not a small market, but the ownership and the team seems to operate. And the reason they operate that is because their play has been so bad and ownership has been so uneven that that's the impression they give off when they're not. And that is a frustrating part of it, which I'm sure that's a frustrating part of that for you as well. In terms of a bold prediction on this team, there's an interesting one from you, Brandon, because we've spoken about Jordan Poole already, and you think that he's got a chance to win most improved player. That is a very hard award to predict because, again, if you expect someone to improve a lot, usually they don't get that consideration, although Tyrese Maxey won it last season, even though we all thought that he would jump up. What is most improved player Jordan Poole look like? What does it mean? Is it 6 assists, really running the offense sort of a player? Is it someone who starts to shoot more efficiently? What does that look like to you?
Oh, you hit the nail on the head. Two things. His vision. He has vision, but I want to see his assist numbers go up, and I think he can. Definitely when he gets the full-time gig at point guard. But becoming a more an efficient player. Both him and Kyle Kuzma were so bad in efficiency last year. There was times where they were shooting the ball 25, 30 times a game. And this was a question that I asked both of them at exit interviews at the end of last season, which was, how do you get the other guys involved? Because this is a young team in a rebuild. You have to prioritize development. And so, both of them know that they have to change their game. They have to be more efficient, take more high percentage shots, utilize the shot clock. Because that was another thing that really frustrated people, which, 3-4 seconds in the shot clock, they already got the ball up. And there's only been one touch. They have to utilize the shot clock. And I think that for him to be successful at point guard, he's got to utilize the shot clock, be a more an efficient player, and definitely utilize, become more of a pass-first guy. And that's why Tyus Jones was such a good point guard last year, because he was a floor general who looked to distribute first. And it was a good thing that Jordan Poole was able to play with him, kind of learn from him. And the reason I think he's going to be a guy who's going to be a comeback player is because he's going to come in the season with a chip on his shoulder. I mean, this guy got smoke from every major sports outlet in the world, man. And he kept working, And, young guys, confidence is key in young players. We see that with Deni. And in a broader sense, we see that with Ben Simmons, a guy who couldn't handle the pressure. So, confidence is key in young guys, man. So the fact that he knows he has to get better, and the fact that he took so much criticism and kept working, shows me that he can handle it.
The team record prediction, Brandon, you've gone with a really low number. You've gone with 20 wins. Is this the worst team in the NBA?
It's going to be one of them.
Yeah.
It's going to be one of them.
So the March, April Wizards Brooklyn battles are going to be absolutely epic. We are going to see players that you have never even heard of playing minutes in some of these games down the stretch for both of these teams as they try and position themselves for a really good spot in the draft. But like we've said, this is not like Brooklyn, it's going to be dire a lot of the time. But I think with Washington, they are going to be terrible. But let's see what Jordan Poole does. How does Alex Sarr look? What about Bub Carrington? Is he and Jordan Poole starting down the stretch? I believe they will. Where's Keyshawn George in this mix? I think that halfway through the season, you talked about trading away Vooch. I think they're going to be doing that. It's all looking to find some sort of a deal so they can convert Tristan Vukcevic so he plays minutes. There's no way that they sign him to a contract to then sign him to a two-way this season without a plan to fully convert that later in the season. So you're going to have these pieces who, while there might not be the absolute key core guy, like Poole, Carrington, Sarr, just seeing what they can do together. I'm not including Kuzma because he's 28 or whatever he is already. He's not a part of that next best Wizards team. But you might see these guys together, even though they're terrible. Hopefully, we see a step up. We see Ryan Keefe teaching and developing, and we see some of those things start to play out for this Wizards team.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, success with the Wizards this year and really the next 3 years is not going to be measured in wins and losses, as hard as it is to say. Progression in the young talent and chemistry is something that we don't talk a lot about. I mean, forming the chemistry with this core, I think, is key, them playing together. And, if you look at, I think the best example real quick is Golden State. If you look at Golden State, everybody they had in Dynasty, I know Clay is gone, but at the height of the Dynasty, everybody was drafted in. And people forget that Steph Curry in the early years of Golden State, he was a guy who was injury prone. He still had to find out what kind of player he was. So chemistry is key. When they started forming chemistry in Golden State, they started gelling together. They had that product. They became Dynasty. And look at the DC, a team that hasn't won a championship since 1978. Chemistry is key. If you want to build a sustainable winner in DC, you've got to build chemistry very early and instill a culture of, dependability.
Yeah, exactly. You need to see how it works together because then you need to make decisions about does it work, doesn't it work, what do we see, how does it all play out, all that sort of stuff are things that we're going to be watching for this season. And Brandon, just to finish us off here, I've got a quick quiz question for you. It's not a super difficult quiz. It's not really even a quiz at all because we head here into the 24-25 NBA season. All I want you to tell me is that when you think of the Washington Wizards, who is the first player that comes to mind who wears or has worn number 24 or number 25? Anyone that comes to mind?
Oh, man, good question. 24. Oh,
there's a lot more people that have worn 24 in history for the Wizards than there is for 25 because 25 has been retired.
Oh, man, that's a good question. I don't even know, man. 24, 25.
I'll tell you now, there's currently a number 24 on the team.
24. I believe who picked 24? I'm having a brain fart tonight, man. I believe Was it Sarr that picked 24?
No, I don't know what number Sarr is wearing, actually. I don't know what.
Yeah, I'm trying to think who picked 24. That's a good question, man.
24 currently is Corey Kispert.
Okay, there you go.
They had Garrison Matthews wore that. Jan Vesely was number 24 back in the day. Tom Gugliotta's probably the most well-known number 24, I would guess, there in history. And then the number 25 was retired for Gus Johnson. So the last time that was worn was back in 1987, and Gus Johnson wore that through till 1972, but now it has been retired for him, and we're going to retire this show, Brandon. So thanks for coming on and talking about this Wizards team, which is going to have some fun players, and we just hope that it's not... Because honestly, last season, the beginning of the year was what just completely tanked everything. They were getting smashed by 25 points by the end of the third quarter in like their first 10 or 15 games, and everything went downhill. So we want some competitiveness. We want to see these young guys and these new roles and all this stuff sort of mesh together, and you're going to have all that covered for us over on the Locked On Wizards podcast.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
So what's going on for Locked On Wizards this week? What can people go and check out at the moment?
We're looking forward to the future. I mean, obviously, we're looking to the next couple of drafts. So I'm going to take a look at the 2025 and 2026 draft and look at the young core that we have and kind of mismatch to see what are the best prospects we can kind of look at, kind of mix with the current young core.
So that's something to check out over at Locked On Wizards. Brandon, thank you again for coming on and talking about the Washington Wizards with me.
Yes, sir. Anytime.
And that does it for me today, talking about the Washington Wizards, a team, again, with a bunch of uncertainty, some roles we need to see play out. People are going to be scared of a lot of these players, but I think fantasy value is going to appear in a lot of these different spots. We just need to be ready to move and make our adjustments when necessary. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up and subscribe and leave your comments down below on this show. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.